Our video for today is integers. We're going to take care of a couple items that will show up on the assignment for you in regards to this. The first one being opposites. They're going to talk about finding the opposite of a number, and that's when we put a negative in front. Shows us that we want to do the opposite of what we're given. So it's the other way, side, or sign that we're looking for. So if a book is open, the opposite would be that we close the book. If you flip a coin heads, the opposite would be tails. If we have a positive 7, we'd have a negative 7. If we'd have a positive 2/3, we'd have a negative 2/3. So it's just the opposite of what we've given. What is the opposite of that? And in regards to what we're talking about, we're going to be mostly doing integers. So if it's a positive, it's going to be negative. If it's negative, it's going to be positive. So the easiest way to do it on some of the problems that we're going to deal with is we're going to count the number of negative signs only. Positives don't matter. We don't care about the positives in the sense of simplifying our signs down of what we need, because we can only have one sign in front of the number at all times. So positives don't matter. So a couple rules I gave you with the other stuff that we've done already in class. If I have an even number of negatives, I'm going to get a positive. If I'm going to get an odd number of negatives, I'm going to get a negative. So this is one little rule that you want to kind of keep in mind as you go through this, or just have your notes out. So an example would be if I gave you this problem here, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negative signs with a 4 in it. We want to simplify all these signs down. So if I have 5 negative signs, 5 is an odd number. So I have an odd number of negatives, that gives me a negative. So I'd end up with a negative 4. If I have the bottom one here, where I have a negative, a positive, and then a series of negatives, I don't even have to worry about this positive here. I can just take it and look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 negatives. So 6 is an even number, so even number of negatives makes it a positive. Because in a sense what we're doing is we're multiplying these together. And it goes back to the rule of multiplying integers of if I have a negative times a negative is a positive, a negative times a positive is a negative. And again, it's odd and evens. So again, even negative, I get a positive answer. Odd number of negatives, I get a negative. So don't make this part too hard. Just count the negative signs as you go through it. For some examples, another term that you're going to get is they're going to ask you what is the additive inverse of the following problem. So additive inverse is basically, it's a fancy way of saying what's the opposite. So this is the way the question will be written. So if they give you this part as the problem, well, what is the additive inverse? It's the opposite. So it's just if this is a positive, this is going to be a negative. In my second example, I have a negative. What's the additive inverse? It's going to be a positive. The numbers don't change. It's the signs that we're looking at in order to do that. So if I have a negative 9.7, the additive inverse or the opposite is 9.7. Same with if I have a positive 4 2/3, I'm going to have a negative 4 2/3 here. So as we go through that. So the key to this is you need to simplify your signs. As we talk about all this together, if you have more than one sign, you need to simplify it. Remember the rule last slide where it had the odds and evens for that. Next thing that you're going to be asked to deal with is absolute value. The technical definition is it's the distance the number is away from 0, or the way I look at it as, again, looking for the simplest way, it's just a number. But there's no signs attached to it. It's not positive, it's not negative. It's just the number that it's there. So if I ask for the absolute value of a negative 4, it's just 4. If I ask for the absolute value of positive 10, it's just 10. Same here, but I have a negative on the outside, so it goes back to one of the first videos that we talked about is this negative isn't affected, so we're just going to bring it right into our answer. Take the absolute value of negative 9. That gives us the absolute value of negative 9 is 9, but because we had the negative outside, it comes out to be a negative 9. So again, absolute value is not a sign, positive or negative, it's just the number. So the different types of problems that they're going to get you into are ones where they have absolute value and then they ask you to do an operation. So in this problem, we have to make sure we take the absolute value first So we're taking the absolute value of a negative 4 gives me a positive 4. Absolute value of a 5 is 5. And then I'm just going to add the values of the numbers together to give me 9. If I look over on this one, number 2, now it's different. Now the absolute value is on the outside, and I have an operation I have to take care of on the inside here. So I go back to my combining rules of negative 5, positive 4. Well, I have different signs, so I subtract. Larger number carries the sign, so 5 minus 4 gives me 1. 5 is positive, so that's why it's positive. But I still have the absolute value on the outside. So the absolute value of a positive 1 is just 1. So there are different problems in how you attack them and what the answer is going to be. So if you get the first one, you have to do the absolute value first. Second one, you have to do what's inside. So in a way, you can kind of think of these as parentheses, and then take care of that as well. So that is absolute value. Again, don't let it get too confusing with what we're doing. So we went over this again, so this is kind of a review, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The combining rules of what we want to do with integers are positive and a positive gives us a positive, negative, negative gives us a negative. If it's the same sign, you're going to add the numbers your sign carries into your answer. If I have a difference of signs, negative and a positive, the larger number is going to carry the sign, but I'm going to subtract my numbers. So I'm going to subtract the number, and larger number carries the sign. And that's kind of the phrase that you're going to hear me say a lot as the year goes on. So one of the things you have to remember too is you can only have one sign in the number. That's it. You can't have more than one. So if you have more than one, you need to simplify it down. So in my examples down here, that's what we're looking at, is I have one negative here in front. In front of this 4, I have 2 negatives. Well, if I have an even number of negatives, that gives me a positive. Now I can combine these two numbers, and a negative 4 and a positive 4 is 0. For my second example, I have 3 signs in front of the 3, so I can forget that positive, but again, I have 2 negatives. Even number of negatives gives me a positive. I have a 2. There's only one sign in there, so I just bring it down. I have 2 signs in front of the 5, which are 2 negatives. And again, even number of negatives gives me a positive, and then I just add straight across. My last example, again, 2 negatives, 4 negatives. So I have an even number of negatives for each one of the problems. And again, these are kind of separators as we go. So I have a positive 9, a positive 5, and a positive 6. Again, add them up left to right, gives you 20. So be careful with that as you are combining and looking at the rules for what do I do with the numbers. Again, we've gone through the multiplication. Multiplication and division are the same. So if I have the same sign, I'm going to get a positive. And that is the same for division. If I get a different sign, I get a negative. And again, odd, even. I have an even number of negatives, positive. Odd number of negatives, I'm going to get a negative. And it again applies for division as well. But again, I got to look at making sure that I have everything simplified. So if I have a negative 4 times a negative 6, I have 2 negatives. That gives me a positive. Now multiply the 4 times the 6. So take these in parts, do the signs, then the numbers as we go. In my second example, we have difference of signs. I have 2 signs in front of the 3. So I have an odd number of negatives here. That simplifies down to a negative. Again, I have an odd number of negatives here, simplifies down to a negative, and now I take care of the multiplication. I have the same, I have 2 negatives, gives me a positive, 3 times 3 gives me 9. In my bottom example here, I have negative 7 times 4 times a negative 2. Well, if I look at the whole thing, I'm multiplying through it all. So I have a negative and a negative. I get 2 negatives, that's an even number, so my answer is going to be positive. And then I can take my numbers and multiply 7 times 4 times 2, gives me 56. For the division part, same thing, you just have to be careful where the negatives are. So this negative would stay outside. This negative and this positive deal with what's inside, so I have a negative times or divided by a positive. So I have an odd number of signs, so I would get a negative inside. But then when I get to my answer, I have 2 negatives in front. I got to simplify it to one sign. So an even number of negatives gives me a positive. For here, again, I have an even number of negatives in my division problem, so it would be a positive answer. 16 divided by 4 would give us 4. Our last example is similar to the first one, except there's one more negative. So my negative down here stays outside. I have two negatives, gives me an even number of negatives, gives me a positive. 36 divided by 6 gives me 6. Well, now I have to simplify my signs here. So I have an odd number of negatives, so I have a -6 for my answer. Last thing is just simply comparing an absolute value. So they're going to throw all this together. Anytime that you're given this, you have to do the absolute value first, bring that down, and then you're going to compare the numbers. 4 is less than 7. So if we have the absolute value here of 12, -12 is 12, absolute value of 12 is 12. Now these two numbers equal, so our sign would be equal in there. And our last example, I have 3. There's no absolute value on there, so that's the sign that goes with it. I do have absolute value around the -4. Gives me 4, so now I compare a -3 is less than a +4, and any negative number will be less than 4. So a couple key points to finish up here. Key points: 1, larger the negative, the smaller it is. So if you're comparing numbers and I have two negatives, the larger negative is actually the smaller number. 2, make sure that you know that if you're combining or you're multiplying or dividing, that's where the key is in knowing what your operation is giving in your problem. Remember to count the negatives. Remember, we don't care about the positive, we're looking just at the negatives. And if we have an odd number of negatives, we have a negative answer. Even number of negatives, we get a positive answer. And the last one is the positives and negatives are separators when you start getting into the order of operation type problems, and then break down the problem using those. So hopefully this will give you a good indication or a good reason to go through and get the negative information. That will take us through the integer part. Good luck with that as we go.